the grandfathers of the 4 females who were pretending to be my older sisters in my Webb the Habsburg family unit when I was born the 18th of January, 1972. When I went home in my parents' custody, legitimately registered at birth, there were 4 older females who were not my older sisters in my household. They were pretending to be my father's daughters after being illegally registered to my parents at birth. They were the children of 4 separate men to my father Duke and Lord Kevin Webb the Habsburg, who gained his royal title in 1984. Their mother was an almost completely identical-looking female to my father's real wife Judith, called Pauline. Pauline had started pretending to be my father Kevin's wife, full-time, around 3 months after he got married on the 3rd of May, 1958. It was follow-up stalking by Australian organised crime, in cooperation with neo-Nazis, as an extension of torture and abuse of my Habsburg royal family during World War II. Pauline had swapped places with Judith, whilst pregnant with the granddaughter of a neo-Nazi who was convicted at the Nuremberg trials immediately after World War II. That neo-Nazi had tortured my father's grandfather Prince Sebastian Habsburg whilst he was illegally held prisoner in Dachau prison in 1944-45. The first illegally registered child of Pauline, the imposter wife of my father, was born on the 25th of March, 1959. She was named after my mother Judith, my father's real wife, and her adopted mother May. Her grandfather was Ricky O'Shea. O'Shea was a maximum security prison inmate in December 1943 in Dachau prison and an avid Liverpool FC supporter. O'Shea was serving 9 life sentences and was never to be released from jail. His prison sentence was labelled the term of his natural life, as there was no death penalty in Germany at the time. He escaped jail when a terrorism group that formed in December 1943 took the jail in a prolonged gunfight over several days. The terrorism group named itself the Neo-Nazis that month. After O'Shea escaped, he was given the illegal job of pretending to run the Dachau jail he escaped from by the Neo-Nazis. Other escaped inmates assumed the identities of the deceased prison staff and pretended to run the jail for him using the real jail staff's identities and uniforms. O'Shea was the one exception to that routine. O'Shea did not assume the identity of the deceased employed prison governor, a man called Aurelius, who was photographed dead in the prison yard shortly after the jail was taken by the neo-Nazis. Instead, the neo-Nazis had O'Shea made over by a professional film production crew as if for a film role and had him illegally use the identity of Hermann Göring instead. Göring had been knocked unconscious, mutilated, and dumped in the jail in his thermal underwear. He was one of the first people to be illegally detained in the jail by the neo-Nazis for being homosexual. O'Shea wore Göring's altered clothing and used Hermann's identity documents whilst pretending to run the jail. O'Shea tortured any male homosexual illegally detained in the jail by the neo-Nazis until the jail was taken at gunpoint by Allied troops from Great Britain in June 1945. One of O'Shea's victims between January 1944 and June 1945 was my father Kevin's grandfather Prince Sebastian Habsburg. When my father got married in May 1958, they replaced his new wife Judith with an almost identical lookalike called Pauline. Pauline was pregnant with O'Shea's granddaughter. Prince Sebastian Habsburg was in palliative care in Austria, terminally ill at the time. My mother Judith went elsewhere, leaving Pauline at home pretending to be my father's wife. Judith dumped the result of the first legitimate pregnancy to my father Kevin Webb the Habsburg, unregistered at birth. The child or children would have been eligible to become Habsburg royal family members. It was done so that a new royal eligible Habsburg baby of my father Kevin Webb the Habsburg would be replaced with the grandchild of a neo-Nazi who tortured my great-grandfather Prince Sebastian Habsburg during World War II instead. They thought it was the ultimate torture tease of Prince Sebastian on his deathbed. They illegally filmed him every day in palliative care, incorrectly assuming he would be sent official royal word of my father's firstborn child in the mail with a photograph. Just to see what happened when he saw the granddaughter of O'Shea instead. A letter was never required, so was never sent. They illegally filmed him every day until he died in 1960, pretending to be waiting for the letter and the photograph of O'Shea's granddaughter to arrive, to film Prince Sebastian looking at it. Instead of Australian organised crime getting footage of Prince Sebastian reading a letter about his grandson Kevin's firstborn eligible Habsburg child, which should have been a new eligible Webb the Habsburg baby, and then seeing the baby photo of O'Shea's granddaughter. They got film and audio of Prince Sebastian being reunited with Kaiser Adolf Hitler the Hohenzollern for the first time since November 1943. My great-grandfather Kaiser Adolf Hitler and my great-grandfather Prince Sebastian were officially the royal Hohenzollern couple in 1943, before Adolf's abduction and illegal imprisonment. Kaiser Adolf Hitler escaped prisoner of war jail in late 1959 and was reunited with Prince Sebastian in the palliative care hospital by Italian law enforcement in 1960. The Australian lunatics got illegally recorded film, audio, and still images of them being reunited, then spending 6 days quietly talking together every day before Prince Sebastian died with Kaiser Adolf Hitler sitting with him in 1960. O'Shea was arrested by Brit troops in June 1945 and eventually tried at Nuremberg starting November 1945. He was found guilty of escaping jail, torturing homosexuals illegally detained in the jail for the rest of World War II, and illegally using the identity of one of his victims, Hermann Göring, whilst doing it. Göring is my surname Webb in German. Hermann was a relative of my Webb family, part French. Lunatics now pretend he was the real Hermann Göring on trial in fictional history media. O'Shea was murdered by other prison inmates in 1946 when they found out who he was, what he did to homosexuals in 1944 and 1945, and that he was pretending to be Hermann Göring when doing it. Ashay was the grandfather of the oldest female pretending to be my oldest sister in my family household when I was born in 1972. She was 12 at the time and looked a lot like her grandfather Ricky. The second-born female illegally registered to my parents at birth, that was pretending to be my second oldest sister when I was born the 18th of January, 1972. The eventual circumstances turned out to have more of the coincidental type, as a flow-on effect, following the crime of baby theft off my father Kevin Webb the Habsburg. My father Kevin Webb became a Habsburg Duke and Lord of Austria and Hungary in 1984. The second illegally registered child was born October 1961. Her biological father was A. Rewalt, a part North American, probably named Rowdy. That Rewalt family were related to part Greek impostors who were executed for pretending to be the Romanov royal family in public in 1917, after the real Romanovs were abducted and murdered in 1916. My mother Judith, my father Kevin's real wife, was a legitimate Romanov who was ineligible to be royalty of Russia. She was the legitimate daughter of Tsarina Alexandra Fyodorova the Romanov's firstborn child, Ioseb Jugashvili, also known by his nickname Stalin. He was ineligible to be Romanov royalty of Russia, was the general secretary of the Communist Party, and the political head of state of the Soviet Union, ending in 1953. He was my grandfather, and died in 1979. I am the only living legitimate Romanov family member in the world, since the death of my estranged mother Judith in 2018. Pauline, the imposter wife of my father Kevin Webb the Habsburg, got pregnant to Rowdy Rewalt's sperm in around January. It was an obvious attempt at further terrorism, stalking and teasing of my grandfather Ioseb, also known as Stalin. My father Kevin's real wife, Ioseb's daughter, dumped the baby or babies he was the father of at birth, around the same time the second imposter child was born. The Rewalt. I would like to point out that my mother Judith was adopted by a Gippsland couple when she was a child, around the age of 3. She was not using the surname Jugashvili when she married my father Kevin Webb. It was likely motivated by the idea of depriving my grandfather Ioseb of a legitimate, part Romanov, grandchild, on top of depriving my father of an eligible Habsburg royal child. The flow-on effects. The new illegally registered female was the granddaughter of a man called Joe Rewalt. Joe ran the prisoner of war jail that my great-grandfather Kaiser Adolf Hitler the Hohenzollern was held prisoner of war in between December 1943 and late 1959 in Yugoslavia. She was 10 when I was born and looked a lot like her grandfather Joe. Joe was a former army general in the USA who was dishonorably discharged for a mass murder of Native Americans. He moved to Yugoslavia afterwards. Yugoslavia was partially set up as a bloc nation by the USA and other North Americans. Joe ran the jail Kaiser Adolf Hitler the Hohenzollern was held prisoner in for nearly 16 years. Kaiser Adolf escaped when Joe forced him to play Russian gun roulette with him at gunpoint in late 1959 and lost. Joe shot himself through the head on his first turn, the second turn overall. Joe had a full set of prison governor keys on his uniform when he shot himself, which were within reach of Kaiser Adolf through the bars of his cell. Kaiser Adolf used them to escape jail. Heinously evil lunatic Albert Einstein's sister, Sadie Einstein, was away visiting her daughter she had before World War II that day. Sadie was living part-time in an apartment outside the cell Kaiser Adolf Hitler was held prisoner in since December 1943. Joe's son Rowdy Rewalt, a trainee prison guard, was at a Yugoslavian national service camp. Heinously evil idiot Sadie was involved in a failed attempt to breed a deliberately inbred baby using Kaiser Adolf Hitler's stolen sperm whilst he was a prisoner in the jail in 1944. Her and her brother Albert were both biological cousins of Adolf. She self-aborted the child in front of Kaiser Adolf, just out of reach of him on the other side of the bars outside his cell, in April 1944, when it was around 3 months gestated. Joe had left her alone with Kaiser Adolf Hitler as if it was forced engagement time in preparation for when the child was born in around November 1944. Sadie tried to make him yell and scream and beg her to stop, as if he thought the child was his only chance for an heir and successor. She sat at the dinner table in a small part of a spinster's apartment she lived in outside his cell, just out of reach of him through the bars. She self-aborted the baby with a knitting needle, then placed the aborted fetus on a different table with a raised circular feature on it. She went and cleaned herself up. When Joe returned, she lied and said it was an incidental miscarriage and there was nothing she could do. Film cameras were installed afterwards and used as security cameras to avoid any further arguments between the staff. From then on, they filmed the monarch of Germany every day in his makeshift prison cell in an underground subway train station that was never used for public transport. Joe turned those film cameras on in late 1959 when he arrived at work, very drunk, after committing a mass murder. He shot everyone in the jail except the prisoner. Then forced my great-grandfather to play Russian gun roulette with him at gunpoint and shot himself through the head on his first turn. He was the grandfather of the second oldest female pretending to be one of my older sisters when I was growing up. She was born in October 1961 via the imposter wife Pauline and illegally registered to my parents at birth. Her birth was less than 2 years after her grandfather Joe shot himself at the jail in Yugoslavia. She was born after my father Kevin's grandfather Prince Sebastian Habsburg died in 1960. The Habsburg royal family estate was illegally withheld from my Webb family after his death, just before she was born. It still is. When I was born the 18th of January, 1972, she was in my family household, pretending to be my father Kevin's daughter. Her grandfather Joe had regularly assaulted and tortured my great-grandfather Kaiser Adolf Hitler the Hohenzollern when he was illegally held prisoner between December 1943 and late 1959. The motives for being there were further stalking and abuse of my Romanov and Habsburg families. The third-born female illegally registered to my parents at birth, that was pretending to be my second youngest sister when I was born the 18th of January, 1972. The circumstances had more of an ad-lib theme. It was yet another instance of the crime of baby theft off my father Kevin Webb the Habsburg, great-grandson of Emperor Franz Joseph I, of Austria and Hungary. Emperor Franz Joseph I was murdered by a terrorism group associated with heinously evil lunatic Albert Einstein in 1916. The sequence of events was intertwined with the first official declaration of World War I. Einstein's terrorism group, the Black Hand, was responsible for assassinating my great-great-grandfather Emperor Franz Joseph I's nephew and his wife in Serbia in 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his spouse were shot dead in a vehicle in the incident. One of Einstein's younger half-brothers was one of the shooters in the incident, with evidence suggesting another was also directly involved. It led to the first official diplomatic document exchange that declared what became World War I. World War I was not declared to attempt to steal royal family estates worldwide, though. Anyone who says it was is mentally unstable. The Einsteins were related, via French Canadians, to lunatics who mass murdered the royal family of France in the 1790s. The perpetrators of the mass murder were from a French territory in South America called French Guiana. The only eligible French royal left afterwards was Napoleon, a descendant of monarch Louis XIV. Lunatics related to the perpetrators of the crime tried to pretend the murders made the perpetrators of the murders the French royal family temporarily, until they were executed around 2 weeks later by the French army. The relatives of the perpetrators started demanding France give them titles, royal residences to live in, and allowances to live off. When they didn't get their way, they started rioting in France regularly in the 1800s. They still do. They then started threatening to victimize others if they didn't get what they were unrealistically demanding, including threats to kill and molest the dead body of anyone related to the old French royal family, or steal another royal family as if compensating themselves for getting nothing for the crimes from France. My Habsburg royal family relatives, the Webb family, are all direct descendants of monarch Louis XIV of France. Louis XIV is where the surname Webb comes from. My surname would be Habsburg, but my grandfather Duke and Lord James and his royal siblings all changed their surname to Webb prior to emigrating to Australia in around 1911 with their mother Ada. It was to signify that Ada's sexual partner, John Webb, was taking over as their male parent figure from their father Prince Sebastian Habsburg, who was staying in Europe to pursue a sailing career. John Webb was a relative of Prince Sebastian, part French, also related to Louis XIV, was Ada's sexual partner, and was unable to have children. During World War I in 1916, Emperor Franz Joseph I's grandnephew and successor to be Charles was abducted, tortured, and murdered by Einstein's terrorism group. He was childless and homosexual at the time. After Charles was dead, they abducted and murdered Emperor Franz Joseph I in the same way before the end of 1916. My great-great-grandfather Franz Joseph I was also homosexual, and his only legitimate child was my great-grandfather Prince Sebastian Habsburg. The Black Hand terrorism group made a brief attempt to replace successor to be Charles with a younger brother of Albert Einstein as an imposter, which failed. It wasn't a realistic attempt to install an imposter. Its failure was mainly due to the Einstein idiot walking into a government office in Austria, claiming he was there to assume the throne because his granduncle the emperor was dead. Emperor Franz Joseph had not been reported dead to, or confirmed as dead with, the authorities in Austria yet. Because Emperor Franz Joseph I was required to reauthorize his son Prince Sebastian as the new emperor to be, and Franz Joseph was already dead, the only option was to declare the constitutional monarchy dissolved permanently. It left only the private Habsburg royal estate owned by my Webb family, and the minor royal titles Duke Duchess, Austria, and Lord Lady, Hungary. My father future Duke and Lord Kevin Webb the Habsburg's imposter wife Pauline, who started pretending to be my father Kevin's wife full-time around 3 months after he got married in 1958, again facilitated the new intruder in my family unit in 1963. Pauline got pregnant again in around January 1963. My father's real wife Judith again got pregnant to her husband around the same time, and dumped the baby or babies unregistered at birth later in the year. They would have been eligible Habsburg royals. Pauline gave birth to a third intruder child in October 1963. The child was a biological paternal van der Mullen. It may be a name familiar to people who have studied the real history of the Jewish Holocaust in Europe during World War II. The child was the granddaughter of a fourth in command at Auschwitz, in Poland. The excuse for the child was the fact that my father Kevin Webb's grandfather Prince Sebastian Habsburg's identity documents were confiscated from him in January 1944, before he was illegally detained by the neo-Nazis in Dachau prison. Prince Sebastian was detained in the prison whilst it was run by escaped former inmates, until June 1945. Prince Sebastian's identity documents were found on the deceased remains of a Jewish man murdered in Auschwitz, Poland. They were found after he was illegally detained in Dachau prison by the neo-Nazis. Heinously evil, mass genocide involved, lunatic fake physicist Albert Einstein used to visit Auschwitz to watch people mass murdered through one-way mirrors at the site. He regularly visited, watched the victims, and pretended they would pass on science and philosophy ideas to him as they died, whilst he was watching them. He was often seen doing a little dance with his tongue sticking out when he was there, watching the heinous acts. He was given a personal guard whenever he went into the Auschwitz complex. A fourth in command of security there, called Van der Mullen. Van der Mullen escorted Einstein everywhere when he was in the site grounds, including watching whatever he watched. Van der Mullen's granddaughter was illegally registered to my father Kevin Webb the Habsburg, grandson of Prince Sebastian Habsburg, in October 1963. It was around 3 years after Prince Sebastian died in 1960. The Habsburg royal family estate has been illegally withheld from my Webb family since 1960. The female received vivid descriptions of Einstein being guarded by her grandfather at the site in Poland regularly from her biological family. She wasn't shy about sharing them if asked by organized crime types. She started pretending to be my second youngest sister when I was born in January 1972. The fourth-born female illegally registered to my parents at birth that was pretending to be my youngest sister when I was born the 18th of January, 1972. The motives and circumstances had that ad-lib theme. Like Ashay's granddaughter, the theme was the neo-Nazis. It was yet another instance of the crime of baby theft off my father Kevin Webb the Habsburg, great-grandson of Emperor Franz Joseph I, of Austria and Hungary. The fourth time was a repeat of the basic scenario for the first illegally registered child. The fourth-born child illegally registered to my parents at birth's grandfather was a man surnamed Richardson. Richardson was a maximum security prison inmate serving life without parole in Germany in 1943 in a temporary maximum security prison in Germany. I owned the site the prison was on as part of my Hohenzollern royal family estate. Richardson was serving serious time for heinous, sexually themed, and violent crimes. Similar to Dachau prison, the neo-Nazis took the prison Richardson was in at gunpoint in December 1943. They caused the escape of hundreds of maximum security inmates living in the jail. They told the escapees they could join the neo-Nazis or go free to fend for themselves in late 1943 World War II Germany. Almost all of the escapees, if not all, made the decision to join the terrorism group which was established by name that month. The escaped inmates then took over running the jail, using the identities and clothing of the deceased staff of the jail. The one exception was Richardson. Instead of him using the identity of the deceased prison governor employed at the jail, they had him made over by a professional film production crew to look like Rudolf Hesse instead. Richardson then started wearing altered clothing that belonged to Hesse, whilst made over by the award-winning professional film crew, as if for an acting job pretending to be Hesse. Richardson had Hesse's identity documents in his clothing when pretending to run the jail between December 1943 and June 1945. After the prison was taken over by the escaped inmates using the deceased staff's identities, except for Richardson the imposter Hesse, the neo-Nazis decided to fill the jail with homosexual females illegally detained from the German public, particularly from the major cities. The jail became very overcrowded very quickly in early 1944. Richardson, pretending to be Hesse, then coordinated the torture of the female homosexuals illegally detained in the jail he escaped from for the neo-Nazis. An estimated over 20% of the illegally detained females were part Australian. There were regular remarks themed around the idea that every adult homosexual female in Germany who was part Australian was in the jail. There were also large numbers of Iraqi and Canadian homosexual females illegally detained in the prison. Richardson tortured them whilst he pretended to run the jail until it was taken at gunpoint by troops from the Allies in mid-1945. Richardson was pretending to be Rudolf Hesse when arrested, wearing Hesse's clothing and illegally using Hesse's identity documents. Richardson was one of the people tried at the Nuremberg trials starting November 1945. He was tried for escaping the jail, torturing homosexual females illegally detained in the jail for the neo-Nazis, and illegally using the identity of Rudolf Hesse whilst doing it. Fake history lunatics now pretend Richardson was really Rudolf Hesse on trial at Nuremberg for television and the internet, amongst other forms of media. The real Hesse was not involved in the Nuremberg trials at all. He died quietly, almost unnoticed, in Gippsland, Australia in the 1960s. When imposter wife of my father Kevin Webb the Habsburg got pregnant for a fourth time in 1966, she got pregnant with prison escapee cum neo-Nazi Richardson's granddaughter. Similar to the first illegally registered female, who was Dachau prison escapee cum neo-Nazi Ricky Ashay's granddaughter. The fourth and final illegally registered intruder into my family unit was born in March 1967. As with the previous three, my father Kevin's real wife Judith had gotten pregnant again and dumped the result of the pregnancy elsewhere, unregistered. The child or children would have been eligible Habsburg royals. USA Air Force in Army uniforms refused to assist any female who appeared to be Australian when evacuating the jail and providing on-site medical assistance using British nurses at the end of World War II. There was a thorough investigation into the lack of duty of care after WW2, and all parties involved were thoroughly punished for it. The events further exposed past instances of crimes against Australians during World War I to people amongst the rest of the USA and to a lesser extent, the United Kingdom. The fourth child of imposter wife Pauline, the granddaughter of Richardson, started pretending to be my youngest sister when I was born the 18th of January, 1972.